We own your code, sweetheart, the new CTO laughed, firing me. I handed him a folder. Actually, read paragraph 4. He read it, froze, and looked at the CEO. Sir, he doesn't work for us. He licenses the tech to us. We just evicted our... The words hung in the air like smoke after a fire, thick and suffocating. The CEO, Richard, stared at me across the conference table, his eyes wide as if I were some kind of ghost, something to be feared, but not truly understood. His hands were flat on the table, knuckles white from gripping the edge, his mind clearly racing to process the implication of what I'd just revealed. It was supposed to be a simple meeting. Well, at least that's what I thought when I walked in. The usual corporate pep talk, the kind you've heard 1,000 times: synergy, optimization, agility. All those buzzwords that never meant anything except a veiled excuse to cut corners and tear down what was actually working. But this time I felt it, something was different. And when Daniel West, the new CTO, stood at the front of the room with his smug smile and startup turned savior attitude, I knew exactly what was coming. Daniel was young, barely 28, wearing a fitted vest that screamed, "I'm the future," while his cologne practically choked the life out of any pretense of humility. His shoes shone under the fluorescent lights, too clean for someone who supposedly understood the technical complexity of the company's core infrastructure. His posture was straight, his hands clasped behind his back, as he launched into his tirade about the company's future. But what he was really saying was that everything I'd built, the systems I'd coded under pressure in the trenches during the 2020 logistics nightmare, was about to be tossed out like last season's fashion. I had a front row seat to the start of the disaster. He was presenting his vision for a new tech stack, a shiny microservices ecosystem powered by AI. At least, that's what he called it. He slapped a slide onto the projector with a bunch of meaningless circles and arrows, a diagram that looked like a toddler had been given a marker and a caffeine shot. The kind of diagram you'd see in every Silicon Valley pitch meeting, but never in any real working system. I sat there, cradling my lukewarm coffee, watching him ignore the looks of confusion on the faces around the table. The engineers, all seasoned veterans, exchanged silent glances. They knew. I knew. This was madness. But it wasn't the madness that made my stomach twist, it was the arrogance behind it. The confidence that he could wave a magic wand and replace years of work with an oversimplified idea of progress. I could feel the words rising in my chest, the fight I'd been holding back for months, threatening to spill out. "Excuse me," I said, breaking the silence with a voice that felt too dry for how much anger had been building inside me. The room turned. All eyes were on me. I hadn't said anything in a meeting for months, but I couldn't let this slide. "That garbage you're talking about. It handles 90% of our vendor compliance. You take that out, and you're not just pivoting, Daniel, you're chopping the legs off the company." I didn't care that I was the only one in the room speaking up. I didn't care that Daniel's eyes scanned me with that patronizing look. Like I was just some relic from a bygone era, no longer useful in the fast-moving world of innovation. He looked at my messy bun and my faded T-shirt, as though those were enough to discredit the 6 years I'd poured into this company. The long nights I'd stayed up with insomnia to patch a system that had kept them from drowning. "Right, Emily," he said, turning away from me to click through his slides. "Look, sweetheart, I appreciate what you did back in the day, but we're not running a history museum here. We're building the future." The word, sweetheart, dropped into the air like a stone, and I could almost hear the others shifting uncomfortably in their chairs. The subtle shift in the room was palpable. No one said anything, but I knew they could feel it. The dismissal. The sense of being tossed aside, because I didn't fit the shiny new image Daniel wanted to build. He didn't see the value of my work. He didn't even know what I'd done, let alone understand it. To him, I was just some tired employee with outdated code. "You don't need whatever this patchwork is," he continued, his smile tight. "We need agility. We need velocity." I clenched my fists under the table. It wasn't the words themselves that stung, but the way he said them. Like he was the one who'd pulled the company out of the depths of disaster, like his magic future was more important than the foundation built on sweat, desperation, and sleepless nights. I didn't respond immediately. I let the silence fill the room for a beat. The other engineers were practically cowering under the weight of Daniel's words, too afraid to speak up. But I wasn't afraid. I wasn't going to be another invisible cog in a machine. "Not today. Here's the thing," I said, leaning back in my chair and folding my arms across my chest. "You can talk about agility all you want, but you can't build a house by knocking down the walls without understanding what's holding them up." Daniel turned back toward me, eyes narrowing, as if the condescending tone he'd been using had suddenly failed him. He didn't know what I was about to drop on him. "I built the backbone you're trying to dismantle," I said. "That garbage you're talking about. I wrote it. And I didn't sign an employment contract, I licensed it to you. The room went still. You could almost hear the gears turning in the heads of the junior engineers who, until this moment, had no idea what I'd actually done for the company. Daniel's expression shifted. His smile faltered for a fraction of a second, but it was enough to let me know I'd just moved the chess pieces in my favor. His jaw tightened, and his eyes flicked to the CEO, who looked like he'd just been served a cold drink of reality. The silence dragged on, and I watched as Daniel's face morphed from smug confidence to something less sure, something more uncertain. The endgame had begun. I could see the doubt settling into Daniel's eyes, as the words I had dropped echoed in the conference room. His confidence faltered just for a moment, but it was enough to make the rest of the room shift uncomfortably. I knew he hadn't expected a confrontation like this. He probably thought I was just another legacy hire, some token employee holding on to the past while he ushered in a shiny, AI-driven future. But I wasn't just some cog in the machine. I was the machine. Or at least, the part that kept it from breaking down. Daniel turned to the CEO, Richard, for some kind of support. But Richard didn't say anything. He just stared at me, his eyes narrowed, probably trying to figure out if I was bluffing. The silence in the room stretched, and I let it hang there, a constant reminder of the power I now held in my hands. Let's not get bogged down in the past, Daniel finally said, attempting to brush it off. We're looking to the future here. We need to adapt, move quickly and adapt. I interrupted, my voice calm but cutting through his words like a knife. You don't adapt by erasing what's worked. You don't throw out the engine just because you want a new paint job. The system you're talking about doesn't just run our logistics. It runs everything. I let the weight of those words settle. You take it out, and you're taking the company down with it. Daniel opened his mouth to respond, but I could see the wheels turning in his head, processing the implications of what I was saying. He wasn't just firing a programmer, he was attempting to dismantle the very thing that held the company together. And he had no idea how deep the roots went. He tried to recover, smoothing over the crack in his armor. Look, I appreciate what you did, Emily. But we're moving in a new direction. The tech is old. The team needs agility, speed, and what you've built, it's just not sustainable for the long run. Agility. The buzzwords I'd heard all too often from these corporate types. They thought they could replace years of hard work with a few fancy terms and a snazzy new software stack. But they didn't understand the system. They didn't understand me. I could feel the room watching me now. The engineers, the junior devs, all the faces that had once seen me as the backbone of this place. I was still the reason their servers didn't crash during the busiest times, the reason the orders kept flowing, the reason the systems didn't break when the world outside fell apart. They knew. They knew what I was capable of. And they knew that if Daniel had his way, it would all come crumbling down. I took a slow breath, my fingers tapping lightly against the edge of the conference table. You're right about one thing, I said, my voice lowering. We are moving in a new direction. But I'm not the one getting left behind. I pushed the folder forward, watching as Daniel's eyes followed it. Richard glanced at the folder, clearly confused. What's this? He asked, his voice uncertain. I wasn't sure if it was genuine confusion, or just his usual corporate bluff. That's the licensing agreement, I said, keeping my tone even. The one I signed when you brought me in. The one that says I own the code. I felt the satisfaction settle in my chest as I handed it over. I'm not your employee, I'm the landlord. You're renting the software. And unless you've paid the quarterly fee, you're in breach of contract. Daniel hesitated before picking up the folder, his fingers tracing the edges as though it might bite him. I watched him scan the first few lines of the document. I could see the gears grinding in his head, as the reality of the situation began to settle in, and then I watched his face go pale as he reached paragraph 4. He froze, his eyes darting from the paper to me, then to Richard, who was still staring at the table. Richard didn't understand. Not yet. But Daniel did. His eyes shifted back to the CEO, wide with the dawning realization. Sir, Daniel began, his voice faltering as he looked at Richard. He doesn't work for us. He licenses the tech to us. We just evicted our. The words trailed off as the weight of the moment hit him. He was realizing it, but too late. I'd played my cards, and now the table had turned. Richard shifted uncomfortably, his face growing pale, his gaze flicking between me and the documents in front of him. I could see the tension building in his shoulders as the words sunk in. The room had gone silent. No one knew how to react. The junior devs, the engineers, the managers who had been silent through most of the meeting, were all watching now, their eyes wide with shock. They hadn't realized it before, but now they were beginning to understand just how much they depended on me. I'm not just some legacy hire, I said quietly, my voice carrying through the room. I built this company's backbone. And you're trying to tear it down without understanding what's holding it up. Daniel opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Richard looked at him for a moment, then back at me, his expression unreadable. The tension was so thick you could cut it with a knife. It was quiet for a long moment before Richard finally spoke, his voice tight with uncertainty. "We'll need to talk about this," he muttered, his eyes flicking from me to Daniel. I didn't wait for him to finish. I knew the next steps. I knew exactly what I had to do. I stood up, grabbing the folder from the table, my eyes locking onto Daniel's for a moment. I could see the realization, the panic, setting in. "You're going to need to pay the fee," I said, my voice calm but unwavering. "And you're going to need to do it fast. Otherwise, this whole future you're building, it's going to be nothing but smoke and mirrors." With that, I turned and walked out of the room, leaving the echoes of their stunned silence behind me. I walked out of the conference room, the door clicking shut behind me. The silence in the hall felt deafening, almost like the quiet before a storm. My heart was calm, steady, like it had been waiting for this moment for months, years even. The weight of the situation was slowly sinking in, but I didn't let myself linger on the enormity of what had just happened. I had a plan, and I wasn't going to let anything, least of all a bunch of tech bros, distract me from the endgame. I passed by a few of the junior devs who had been in the meeting, their eyes shifting quickly away from mine, as if they didn't want to be caught watching me. The air felt heavier now, the invisible walls of corporate politics tightening around me. I didn't care. I was used to it. I'd been a ghost in this company for years, barely acknowledged, but always essential. The hard part was over, but there was more to do. I headed to my cubicle. Well, technically, it wasn't even my cubicle. It was the corner of the office where they had shoved me after they figured out I wasn't a real employee, just a contractor with a license agreement, no real benefits, no fancy title. Just the code that kept the whole damn company running. I sat down at my desk and pulled out my laptop, the one I used when I needed to step outside the company's walls. The familiar hum of the old machine soothed me as I powered it up. It was strange how something so simple could feel like a lifeline. A connection to the work I had poured myself into. The work that had saved this company when everything else was falling apart. It had been a nightmare back in 2020, warehouses shutting down, supply chains collapsing, but I was the one who had coded the system that kept everything running. They didn't pay me enough to acknowledge it, but I knew, and now, I knew how to make them pay for it. I logged into my personal admin console, the one hosted on a server I paid for every month out of my own pocket, in some quiet, unmarked basement in Estonia. Not even the CFO knew about this server. It was mine. I was the landlord and this was my house. I opened up the license status page and stared at the screen. The server was still live, still pinging every hour, still checking in with the software. The system was still mine. They hadn't paid, but they didn't know what that meant yet. The breach was already happening. Richard might not have realized it yet, but the clock was ticking. I checked the payment status again. No pending transactions. It was almost like they thought I would just let them get away with it. Their arrogance was laughable. I leaned back in my chair and took a deep breath, letting the moment stretch. The worst part was over, but the fun part was coming. I'd spent years working on this company's infrastructure. Years creating something that was so vital that they couldn't even function without it. Now it was time to remind them of that. I could hear the faint buzz of voices outside my cubicle. I didn't care. No one was going to stop me now. Not Daniel, not Richard, not anyone in this damn office. I had everything I needed, and they had no idea what they were about to walk into. I could almost hear their panic through the walls, the growing sense of dread that was going to hit them, when they realized the systems were locked down. I clicked a few buttons, navigating through the interface that connected to their main systems. With a few keystrokes, I initiated the freeze. The cascade would start in a few minutes. It wasn't going to be instantaneous. I wanted them to sit with it for a bit. Let them feel that moment of uncertainty, that slow building panic as the systems they depended on started to grind to a halt. The payroll system would fail first. Then inventory. Then vendor payments. Each failure would be its own little fire, burning brighter as the day went on. I checked the clock. It was still early, just after 10 in the morning. They wouldn't realize what was happening until much later. Maybe around noon when things started to fall apart. By then, they'd be desperate. And I would be watching from the sidelines. My phone buzzed, pulling me out of my thoughts. It was a text from Mike, one of the junior devs who had been in the meeting. Mike had been around long enough to know the score. He wasn't stupid. "Emily, are you okay?" He texted. "Is this for real? Everything is messed up here. The payroll system's down. People are freaking out." I smiled to myself, tapping a response quickly. "Don't worry about me, Mike. Just make sure your resume is up to date. You never know when you'll need it." I set the phone down and turned back to my screen. I was in control now. They had no idea how deep they were in it. By the time they realized what had happened, it would be too late. The email alert came through a few minutes later, and I clicked it open. The subject line was a reminder that the quarterly payment for the license had been due. No transaction had been processed. No money had been sent. I grinned. They were playing their last card. And they had no idea that I was holding the ace. They'd breached the contract, and I was about to make them pay for it. I leaned forward, my fingers hovering over the keys. I had the system's fate in my hands. The hard part was done. Now, it was just about waiting for the moment to strike. I knew what was coming. And I was ready for it. The real game had just begun. I took another deep breath, letting the tension build. The systems were about to lock. The company would be paralyzed, and they'd have no one to blame but themselves. I wasn't doing this out of spite or revenge. This was business. They needed to learn what happens when you try to exploit someone who knows the game better than you do. It was time to hit the button. The buzz of the office around me felt distant. Like the sounds were muffled by a thick layer of glass. I could hear the tapping of keyboards, the occasional laughter, the low hum of conversation, but none of it mattered. The machine was ticking, and I was the only one who knew it. Outside my little corner, no one seemed to realize the weight that had shifted in the room, just hours ago. I was in control now, but I didn't feel the rush of power that people usually associate with a moment like this. There was no excitement, no joy in the fact that I had just secured the upper hand. The adrenaline was different this time, calm, measured. It was the quiet before the storm. The kind of calm you feel when you know the enemy is about to realize just how deep they've dug their own grave. I took a sip of my cold coffee. The bitterness a stark contrast to the warmth I was used to. It felt like an omen somehow. I'd never been one for superstition, but something about this moment, sitting in the very cubicle they had shoved me into, made everything feel like it was coming full circle. I hadn't signed up for this, being dismissed by a young CTO, who thought he could dismantle a legacy without understanding it. But that was the reality now. A reality I was about to change. My laptop screen flickered slightly, and I checked the admin console again. Everything was running as expected. The system was locked down, the fail-safes in place. But there was something more. I wasn't just locking out their systems. I was locking them in. The panic would start slowly, creeping in like a fog over the office. First, the payroll system would go down. They'd start getting complaints. Then, the inventory system. No orders would process. No shipments would leave the warehouse. They wouldn't know what hit them. Not at first. They'd scramble to fix the issues, to patch things up, but there was nothing they could do without the access I controlled. I sat back in my chair, running my hands through my hair, and let out a slow breath. The tension in my shoulders didn't seem to go away. It had been building for so long, and now it was finally breaking free. This was the moment where they would have to come crawling to me. They would have to beg for the very thing they had tried to destroy. The text message from Mike earlier still lingered in my mind. He'd been a part of the team for just a few months. Bright-eyed, eager to learn, but still too green to understand the game being played in the higher-up offices. His message, asking if I was okay, felt sincere but naïve. He had no idea just how deep this was going to cut. He didn't understand what it meant when you lose sight of the people who keep the lights on. He would though. They all would. I opened up the system log on my laptop, checking for any incoming requests. The systems were quiet now, too quiet. The waiting felt like it was stretching into eternity. But it was coming. I could feel it in my bones. The moment when the calls would start. When the emails would flood in. When panic would ripple through the company like a chain reaction. The first text came in just after noon. Mike again. His words were rushed, frantic. Emily, what's happening? Payroll's down. The vendors can't process orders. It's all going wrong. They're all freaking out in the break room. I let out a soft chuckle. Of course they were. They always were, when they didn't know what was happening behind the scenes. It was a funny thing, watching people like Daniel and Richard push the panic button for themselves. They'd created their own mess, and now they had no choice but to wade through it. I didn't respond right away. It wasn't that I didn't care. It's just that I didn't need to. Mike would figure it out soon enough. They all would. The phone buzzed again, but this time, it wasn't Mike. It was a number I didn't recognize. The caller ID showed, Quantum Ops HQ. And I smiled to myself. Richard, it had started. I hit accept and placed the phone on speaker, leaning back in my chair, taking my time with the moment. Hello. I said, my voice steady, a slight edge to it that I knew would make Richard uncomfortable. Emily, this is Richard. We've got a situation. His voice crackled, the panic already creeping in. Yeah, I can hear it. I replied, my tone smooth, like I was talking to an old acquaintance. What's going on over there? The systems, everything's down. Payroll's failing, orders aren't processing. We think it's a server issue, maybe a logic bomb. Richard stammered, his voice rising in pitch as the realization hit him. Did you do something? What's going on? I paused for a moment, letting him stew in the silence, knowing that the pressure would build on him with every second that passed. Finally I answered. Simple. Richard. I said, keeping my voice calm, like I was explaining a minor issue to a child. You're in breach of contract. You missed the quarterly payment, and now, the system is locked. No more orders, no more payroll. I told you what would happen if you didn't pay. I could hear his breath catch on the other end, the realization fully setting in. He wasn't getting out of this. There was no tech solution, no quick fix. It was all out of his hands now. Emily, please, Richard begged. You're holding us hostage. You can't just. I can and I did. I interrupted, leaning forward slightly. You should have read the contract more carefully. All of this could have been avoided if you just made the payment. But you didn't, and now the consequences are here. There was a long pause, a moment of disbelief and defeat hanging between us. What do you want? Richard finally asked, his voice tight. I want you to understand how badly you've miscalculated. I replied. I'm not here to negotiate. I'm here to remind you that you've lost. And if you want the systems back online, you'll have to pay the price. The phone line went silent for a moment, and I could hear the faint sound of muffled voices in the background. Probably Daniel. Probably the rest of the panic-stricken team trying to figure out what had gone wrong. I'm waiting, I said, the words flowing out slowly, giving Richard just enough time to feel the pressure of the moment. What's it going to take? He finally asked, his voice cracking. 2.6 million. I said, like I was quoting a price for a rare antique. You'll need to buy the license. That's the only way out of this. 2.6 million. Richard gasped. That's extortion. No, I said, leaning back in my chair with a small smirk. That's the price of your ignorance. The line went dead. The phone call from Richard cut off abruptly. But the silence on my end felt louder than anything. My finger hovered over the screen for a moment. But I didn't bother trying to call him back. I knew he would have to reach out to me. He had no choice now. I sat there, still, letting the reality of the situation settle in. The adrenaline rush from locking them out of their own systems was starting to ebb away, leaving a strange calm in its place. The ball was in their court, and I wasn't about to give them any more room to breathe. They would come to me. They always did when their tech was at the mercy of someone who understood it better than they did. I glanced at the clock. It was still early, just a little after noon. The day was young, but the damage was already done. I could picture it already, employees pacing the halls, staring at their screens, the emails starting to pile up with error messages. They were scrambling now, trying to figure out what had gone wrong. By the time they realized the root cause, it would be too late. The chaos would already be set in motion. I took another sip of my coffee, the bitterness lingering on my tongue. My mind wandered back to the moments before I had made the call to lock them out. The weeks of slow, suffocating frustration, watching Daniel come in and try to dismantle everything I'd worked for, all for his shiny new vision of agility and speed. It had always been about his ego, about proving to the world that he was the one who could save the company, even if he had to erase everyone else to do it. I could almost hear his voice in my head now, condescending and dismissive. Look, sweetheart, your code is holding us back. We need to be faster. We need to be leaner. The irony was almost too rich to handle. He had no idea that the so-called legacy garbage he was so quick to dismiss had literally saved their asses when the world was falling apart in 2020. The system I'd built was the reason they hadn't gone bankrupt, when the global supply chain had ground to a halt. Without me, they would have been just another startup with a great idea and no execution. But Daniel and his shiny vest had no respect for the work that had gotten them here. I shook my head and pulled myself back to the present. The fight wasn't about that anymore. It wasn't about proving myself to anyone. It was about business now. They had breached the contract. They had tried to throw me aside, and now I was making them pay. The $2.6 million was a fraction of what they'd made from the platform I built for them, but it would sting all the same. And more than the money, it was about showing them that they couldn't just erase people like me, people who actually knew how to make things work. The phone buzzed again, snapping me out of my thoughts. This time it was Mike. I could practically hear the nervousness in his text. Emily, the whole office is in chaos. HR is getting flooded with questions, and they have no answers. What's going on? Why aren't we getting paid? I smiled at the screen for a moment before typing back. Tell them to update their resumes, Mike. This is just the beginning. And make sure you don't get caught in the crossfire. Don't say anything to anyone, just sit tight. I hit send and set the phone down. I wasn't worried about Mike. He'd been in the business long enough to understand the situation, even if he didn't completely grasp the weight of what had just happened. He was a good kid, eager to learn but still green. The others though, they'd feel it soon enough. Especially the ones who thought they were immune to the fallout. I let out a long breath, leaning back in my chair as I let the silence settle in around me again. They would try to fix it, I knew that. But it wouldn't be easy. The systems weren't just down, they were crippled. And I was the only one who had the keys to bring them back to life. If they wanted those keys, they'd have to come to me. The thought of how much they would squirm before they realized they had no leverage made me feel strangely satisfied. I wasn't a victim in this story. I was the one in control. They were the ones who had crossed the line, who had pushed too far. And now, they would pay for it. As I sat there, watching the quiet office around me, I thought about what came next. Once they paid, once I had what I wanted, I would walk away from this place for good. I'd take my money, my code, and leave behind a company that had forgotten its roots. The irony of it all was that they needed me far more than they realized. And when they finally came crawling back to me, begging me to save them, I would already be gone. The sound of my phone buzzing again interrupted my thoughts. This time, I didn't hesitate. It was Richard. The negotiations had begun. Emily. Richard's voice crackled through the speaker. We need to talk. You know we can't run this business without your system. Let's discuss this payment. I leaned forward, eyes narrowing slightly, and I could feel a grin tug at the corners of my mouth. We can talk, Richard. But understand this, I'm not negotiating. You breached the contract, and now you're paying the price. The silence on the other end told me everything I needed to know. He knew it, I had him right where I wanted him. 2.6 million, I continued. Take it or leave it. Richard's voice was quiet now, strained. I don't think you understand, Emily. You're making this harder than it needs to be. You know how important this is. Let me be clear, I said. You've already made it hard. You're the ones who decided to play games with me. Now, you'll pay for it. I could feel the shift on the other end. He wasn't going to fight me any longer. Not when it was clear that I had all the power. The deal was done. The silence on the other end of the line felt suffocating. Richard's voice had gone quiet, and for a moment, I thought maybe he wasn't going to respond. But then he exhaled slowly. The kind of breath you take when you're trying to buy time. I could hear the weight of the situation bearing down on him. I was still in control, and I knew it. Amelie, he started, his tone softer now, more cautious. You don't have to do this. We're a team here, we can fix this. I leaned back in my chair, letting the words hang in the air for a beat. I could practically hear the gears turning in Richard's head. He was trying to figure out his next move. But it was too late for that. He had already made his choice, and now there was no going back. No, Richard, I said, my voice steady, cutting through the tension. We're not a team. I was never part of your team. You thought you could just erase me, dismiss the work I did. But I'm not some relic from the past. I built this company's infrastructure. I saved you when the world was falling apart. And now you've crossed the line. You don't get to walk away from that. I could hear him shift, probably trying to steady himself, trying to get back to his corporate speak. But I wasn't interested in listening to that. The corporate jargon, the empty promises, they meant nothing to me now. I had the upper hand. And I was going to make sure they felt every ounce of it. We're talking about $2.6 million. I continued, my voice calm, almost businesslike. That's the price for your ignorance. For assuming you could toss me aside and still keep everything running smoothly. It's not extortion, Richard. It's the cost of your mistake. I know we've made mistakes, but this is extreme, Emily. Richard said, his voice trembling slightly. You're holding us hostage. Please, we need to fix this without. I cut him off before he could finish. My patience running thin. Fix this. I repeated, my tone sharp. You think you can just wave a magic wand and fix this? It's too late for that. You had your chance. You had every opportunity to do things the right way. But you didn't. And now, here we are. You don't get to undo the damage by making excuses. There was a long pause, and I could hear Richard's breathing on the other end, the sound of someone cornered, trapped by their own arrogance. I didn't feel sorry for him. Not even a little. Finally, he spoke again, quieter now, almost defeated. How do we even get the money together? That's a huge sum, Emily. I could almost hear him calculating in his head, realizing just how much he was about to lose. The company had been living on borrowed time, and now it was coming due. I wasn't going to make it easy for him. You find a way, I said flatly. This isn't my problem anymore. I'm not here to solve your financial issues. You want the keys back, you pay, and you pay now. Another long silence. Then I heard Richard sigh heavily. He knew there was no way out of this. He'd pushed too hard, and now he had to face the consequences. Fine, he said finally, his voice resigned. We'll make the payment. But this isn't over, Emily. We're going to get our systems back, and we're going to fix this. You won't win in the long run. I chuckled softly, shaking my head even though he couldn't see me. We'll see about that, I said, my voice steady, unwavering. For now, I'm the one holding the cards. And when you're ready to pay, you know where to find me. The line went dead again, and I sat there for a moment, letting the weight of it all settle in. The deal was done. Richard and Daniel would have to come up with the money, or they would be left with nothing. They had crossed a line, and now they were going to pay for it. They thought they could get away with treating me like an afterthought, like some expendable cog in the machine. But I wasn't the one who had underestimated them. I checked the time. It was nearing 2 in the afternoon. The office would be buzzing with activity, but none of it mattered. None of it had any real impact anymore. They were all caught in the web now, spinning their wheels and trying to figure out what had gone wrong. They hadn't realized just how much they needed me until it was too late. My phone buzzed again, and I glanced at the screen. It was Mike again. I hesitated before opening the message. I didn't want to get dragged back into the chaos just yet, but curiosity got the better of me, and I tapped the notification. Emily, the message read, everything's still down. HR is freaking out. Do we need to go to the press with this? What are you doing? I smiled to myself as I read his words. He didn't know it yet, but this was exactly how it was supposed to be. He wasn't going to understand the full picture until it was over, until the dust had settled. I quickly typed back. Don't do anything yet, just keep your head down and stay out of it. I've got it under control. As I sent the message, I felt the weight of everything that had happened over the past few days start to ease. I had won. There was no question about it. They would pay, and when they did, they would learn the hard way that you never underestimate the people who make the wheels turn. The story wasn't over, not by a long shot, but the hardest part was done. I stood up and stretched, the tension in my body starting to loosen. The deal was done. The money would come through. And after that, I was gone. I would never have to deal with these people again. They had no idea what kind of Pandora's box they had just opened. But I was already walking away with everything I needed. They might have the CEO and the CTO, but I had the real power, and they would never forget that. I grabbed my jacket, slipping it on with a sense of finality. The quiet satisfaction of the moment wrapped around me like a cloak. The corporate world was just one big game, and I had just made my move. It was close to 4 in the afternoon when the email came through. The subject line read simply, "Payment received." For a moment, I just stared at the screen, letting the reality of what I'd done wash over me. The numbers in my account were real now, tangible. $2.6 million. It was more than I had ever dreamed of, more than I had ever expected from these arrogant people who thought they could erase me. But now, it was mine. All of it. The moment I hit refresh, the payment cleared. I opened up the admin console again. This time, I wasn't watching the status lights for chaos. I was watching for something different, something that signaled the moment of their surrender. It felt strange, this sense of calm that washed over me. I'd spent years dealing with corporate politics. With arrogant managers who thought they knew everything, with startups that were too big for their britches, but never quite knew what to do with the people who kept their businesses alive. I had been their ghost, their unseen architect, and now they were paying me for the privilege of seeing my work firsthand. I didn't feel vindicated, not yet. The check had cleared, but it wasn't over. Not completely. There was still the part where I had to walk away. And that was where I knew the real challenge lay. Not in the battle with them. Not in watching their panic or hearing the desperation in Richard's voice, as he finally agreed to pay. But in leaving. Letting go of everything I'd built. I pulled up the contract once more, reviewing the clauses one last time. I had been meticulous when I wrote this, making sure every detail was ironclad, ensuring there was no way they could get out of it. The clause about unauthorized modifications was there, the one I had used to lock them out of the system. The breach clause. The termination clause. They had crossed every line, and now, there was no going back for them. It wasn't about the money. It wasn't about revenge. It was about control, about showing them that the people they dismissed, the ones who worked the hardest, who stayed up late, who sacrificed their time for the greater good, had the power to take it all back. To walk away with everything and leave them in the dust. They were a ship without a captain now, and I was the one who held the map. But even with that realization, I felt a sense of detachment. This wasn't a victory. It was a business transaction, nothing more. As the email alert pinged again, my phone buzzed with another text from Mike. I had expected it. He had been hovering in the background throughout all of this, watching from the sidelines. I didn't respond immediately. I wasn't ready for his questions yet. I clicked into the message, and his words were even more frantic than before. "Emily, it's all down. P-orders aren't processing. Everything's stopped. People are losing their minds. Is this really happening? What do we do? I stared at the message for a long time before replying. Just stay calm. This is what happens when they try to rewrite history. Don't worry about it. It's over. I set the phone down, feeling a strange heaviness in my chest. I wasn't upset with Mike. I knew he was just caught in the chaos of it all. But I couldn't explain to him what this was. Not yet. He didn't have the perspective I had. He didn't know what it was like to sit in the background, watching all the pieces fall into place. Watching your work be used and discarded, like it meant nothing. He didn't know how it felt to be undervalued for so long, only to realize that when it all came crashing down, you were the one who held the key. But that was what made this so much sweeter. I was the one who had kept them alive for years. I had been the one they leaned on, and now, I was walking away with the only thing that really mattered: the contract, the money, and the power to do whatever I wanted next. I stood up, stretching out the stiffness in my back from hours hunched over my laptop. I glanced at the clock. Nearly 5. I had been in this office for over 6 years. It had been a long ride, but now it was time to let it go. I grabbed my coat from the back of my chair and shrugged it on. The familiar weight of it feeling different somehow. It felt like the last piece of a puzzle I had been building, and now it was finished. I walked through the office one last time, past the conference rooms where the meetings had been held, past the desks where I had worked, my face expressionless. I wasn't angry, I wasn't happy, I wasn't even sad. It was just time. The chaos I had set in motion was about to spiral out of control, and I was walking away from it. The elevators were quiet as I rode down to the ground floor, the hum of the building fading as I left it behind. The doors opened, and I stepped out into the cool evening air, the sounds of the city greeting me as I made my way to the parking lot. My old Ford F-150 sat there, just as I'd left it. The truck had always been my sanctuary, the one constant that hadn't changed no matter how many new faces came and went through the office. I climbed in, closing the door behind me with a finality that made the whole day feel like a dream. I pulled out of the parking lot slowly, letting the tension in my shoulders unwind as I drove. The weight of what had just happened hung in the air, but there was something different now. A sense of freedom, maybe. Or perhaps it was just the realization that I was done with this chapter. The road stretched ahead of me, wide open, and I knew exactly where I was going next. As I merged onto the highway, I pulled out my phone once more. A new text popped up from Mike. "I'm sorry, Emily. We really screwed up. I just don't get how this happened so fast. Are you okay?" I took a deep breath, staring at the screen for a moment, considering how to respond. But then I just typed back, "I'm fine. Just do me a favor, Mike. Don't look back, you'll be alright." I hit send, tossed the phone onto the passenger seat, and let the quiet of the drive take over. The sun was setting in the distance, casting long shadows over the road ahead. The world was still turning, but I had taken the first step in leaving it all behind. I woke up the next morning to a text from Mike. The message was brief but told me everything I needed to know. "Emily, they're still losing it. The systems are down completely. We're getting flooded with complaints. They're in full-blown panic mode. I don't know what's going on, but everything's broken." I didn't bother responding immediately. I already knew what was happening. The clock had started ticking, and I could feel the ripple effects of the decision I'd made the day before. The office would be crawling with chaos. Employees who had once walked past me, without a second glance, were now scrambling for answers, and the company's tech team, once too busy admiring their own ideas, was now struggling to comprehend what was happening. The night before, I had transferred the payment into my personal account, the transaction complete, the money real. But I had also executed the final part of my plan, locking them out of their own systems completely. No more orders, no more payroll, no more anything. It wasn't personal. It was business. They had underestimated me, and now they were paying the price. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't even excited. I had made my point. The $2.6 million was just the icing on the cake. The satisfaction wasn't in the money. It was in the control, the power to leave them hanging by a thread and watch them scramble. I had spent too many years being ignored, dismissed, and undervalued. Now, they were forced to confront the truth. They couldn't function without me. I swung my legs off the bed, feeling the heaviness of what had transpired settle into my bones. The weight wasn't from the money. It was from the realization that everything I'd done had brought me here. I had severed the final tie to that place, the company, the people, the whole damn game. I went to the kitchen, the clink of the coffee pot filling the silence of the early morning. I wasn't worried about Mike or the others. They would be fine. They might not have had the same leverage I did, but they could adapt. As for me, this was a one-way ticket out. I was done. My phone buzzed again. It was a text from Richard, this time the CEO. I smiled as I read the message. "Emily, I understand you've made your point. We've transferred the payment. We're looking for a resolution. Please, let's get on a call. We need the systems back online. I had to hold back a laugh. It was like a child begging for their favorite toy back after they'd thrown it across the room in anger. The desperation was palpable. Richard might have been the CEO, but he had no idea how to handle a situation like this. He hadn't even read the contract properly. He thought I'd just be some disgruntled employee who would fold when pushed hard enough. He was wrong. I let the phone sit on the counter, the temptation to respond already fading. They had made their bed, and now they were lying in it. But they wanted me to fix it. They needed me. They couldn't just buy their way out of this by sending a wire transfer. The truth was that they had no idea how much they depended on me until it was too late. I checked the time. It was still early, but I had a sense of how things would unfold. They would try to fix it on their own first, patching the holes, making the calls, trying to get their team to do something. But they were only delaying the inevitable. They had no one left with the knowledge to do anything. The junior devs. They weren't equipped to handle the mess. Daniel their Richard. Completely out of their depth. I picked up my phone again and finally typed out a response to Richard. You've made the payment, so the systems will be restored. But understand this isn't over. The terms of the contract were clear, and the price for not following them was steep. There's no going back from this. I hit send and set the phone down, taking another sip of my coffee. The calmness of the moment was almost surreal. They were frantically trying to patch things up, trying to salvage what little control they had left. But all I had to do was sit back and wait. The game had shifted, and I was no longer a player. I was the one holding the cards. Later that day, as I sat on the couch, scrolling through the messages that started to pour in, emails from HR, internal chat messages, and more requests from Richard, I felt a quiet satisfaction. The world around me was still turning, but I wasn't part of it anymore. I had already walked away from all of it. When the call finally came, I was ready. Richard's voice was shaky, his usual authoritative tone replaced by a sense of desperation. Emily, we've paid the $2.6 million. The systems are back online. But there's more we need to discuss. We can't just let this go. I heard the panic in his voice, but I didn't care. The damage had already been done. You've paid. I said, my tone calm, measured. That's the only thing that matters right now. The systems are back online, and I've kept my part of the deal. As for what comes next, that's up to you. You can't just walk away from this, Emily. Richard pleaded. You're a part of this company's future. You can't just vanish. I smiled to myself, the tension in my chest easing. I'm not walking away from anything, Richard. I'm moving on. You had your chance. You chose to disregard the terms of the agreement. Now, you'll have to find someone else to replace me. There was a long pause, and I could almost hear him trying to process the situation, but there was nothing to say. The deal had been made, and now they were stuck with the consequences. Well, Richard said after a beat, his voice tight. I guess this is goodbye then. I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. Goodbye, Richard. I hung up the phone and sat back, letting the silence of the room surround me. It was over. Everything had been settled. The company had gotten what it deserved, and I had what I needed to move forward. As I looked out the window, the sun was setting on the horizon, painting the sky with streaks of red and orange. It felt like the end of something, but more than that, it felt like the beginning. A new chapter was waiting for me, one where I would call the shots,